She wore a yellow sundress to my wife's funeral. Not black, not navy, not even a muted gray that might pass in bad lighting. Yellow. The kind you'd put on for a picnic or a trip to the farmer's market on a Saturday morning. She had her hair down, loose, like she was headed somewhere fun afterward. And when she walked past the casket, past the white lilies Eleanor had always loved, past the framed photo of my wife at our cabin in Vermont the summer before she got sick, my daughter-in-law leaned over to my son and whispered something. He pressed his lips together. His shoulders shook. He was laughing. I was 63 years old, standing 6 feet from the body of the woman I'd shared 41 years of my life with, and my son was laughing. I told myself I misread it. Grief does strange things to people. Maybe it was a sob that came out wrong. Maybe Amber had said something tender, something about his mother, something that broke through and he couldn't hold it together. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that right then, because the alternative was something I wasn't ready to face in the middle of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church on a Thursday afternoon in October. Eleanor died on a Tuesday. Pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. She was 61 years old, and she handled it with the kind of quiet dignity that made everyone who visited her cry harder than she did. She never complained, not once. Not when the chemo stopped working, not when we switched to hospice, not even at the very end when I held her hand and she could barely keep her eyes open. She just looked at me and said, "You're going to be okay, Marty." Like her dying was something she was doing to me, and she needed to make sure I'd survive it. My son Brendan was there for some of it. He'd come down from Chicago on a few weekends, always with Amber, always staying at a hotel instead of with us. Amber didn't like our house, which she'd once described to a friend, not knowing Eleanor had overheard, as that cluttered old farmhouse smell. We live outside of Dayton, Ohio. We have a real house. It was Eleanor's grandmother's house, and Eleanor loved every corner of it, every creaking floorboard and drafty window, and the rose bushes along the back fence that she replanted every spring. Amber was from money. Her father ran a commercial real estate firm in Naperville. She'd married Brendan 4 years ago, and I had tried, genuinely tried, to like her. She was smart. She kept herself composed in social situations. She sent birthday cards on time, which Eleanor appreciated. But there was always something underneath it, a quality I could never quite name, a kind of restless calculation, like she was always measuring the room. She measured our house the first time she visited. Not with a tape measure, with her eyes. She walked through the downstairs while Eleanor made coffee, touching things lightly with her fingertips, the edge of the mantel, the frame of the hallway mirror, the legs of the dining room table Eleanor had inherited from her mother. Brendan caught me watching her and shrugged in a way that was supposed to mean nothing. It meant something. I didn't say anything. Eleanor didn't say anything. That was how we handled things. We had been married long enough to know which hills weren't worth dying on. But the yellow dress at the funeral was hard to set aside. Afterward, at the reception back at the house, Amber stood near the kitchen island with a glass of white wine. She'd brought her own bottle and held court with a group of younger relatives who didn't know Eleanor well enough to understand the weight of what they'd just watched. She laughed. Not the polite, muffled kind, the kind that carries across a room. One of Eleanor's oldest friends, a woman named Dot, who'd known my wife since 2nd grade, turned toward the sound and her face did something I'll never forget. It went completely still. She set down her little paper plate of food and didn't pick it up again. Brendan circulated. He shook hands. He accepted condolences with the practiced ease of someone going through motions he prepared for. He didn't look at me much that afternoon. When he did, there was something in his eyes that was hard to read. Not grief, exactly. Anticipation, maybe. I hated that I recognized it. My wife had money of her own. This is something Brendan had always known, and Amber had likely done the math on more than once. Eleanor had been a pediatric nurse for 32 years, and she'd inherited a significant parcel of land from her uncle in Tennessee that we'd eventually sold at a considerable profit. She also had investments that her father had started for her when she was young, managed well over decades, grown quietly. We had never flaunted any of it. We drove sensible cars. We took one nice vacation a year. But the money was there, and Brendan was not foolish, and neither was Amber. What they didn't know, what no one knew except Eleanor and her attorney, was that Eleanor had spent the last 6 months of her life quietly rewriting her affairs. She hadn't told me everything. That was intentional on her part, actually. Eleanor knew me well enough to know I would have argued, would have wanted to soften the edges, would have said something like, "He's still our son." So she handled it herself, with the precision and care she brought to everything. She had a single leather journal she kept on the nightstand those last months, and she wrote in it every day, sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for an hour. I never read it while she was alive. She never asked me to. After the reception, after the last car pulled out of the driveway and I was alone in the house for the first time, I sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning on any lights. The house still smelled like her. I wasn't ready for that to change. Brendan called the next morning, which surprised me. We hadn't spoken privately since before the funeral. He asked how I was doing in the way people ask when they're clearing the path toward what they actually want to say. He got to it within 5 minutes. He said he wanted to talk about Mom's arrangements. He said it in a tone that was careful and measured, Amber's fingerprints all over it. He'd like to sit down with me and the attorney together, he said, just to understand where things stood. He mentioned the Tennessee property, even though we'd sold it years ago, which told me the research he'd done was either incomplete or old. I told him I'd be in touch. The attorney's name was Gerald Forsyth, and Eleanor had worked with him for years. He called me 2 weeks after the funeral and said he was ready when I was. I drove to his office on a Wednesday morning in November, the kind of flat gray Ohio morning that feels like it goes on forever. Forsyth was a quiet man in his late 60s, with the kind of steady manner that made you trust him immediately. He'd told me Eleanor had given him very specific instructions about how the reading was to be handled. Brendan and Amber drove in from Chicago. They arrived at Forsyth's office in a rental car, Amber in a tailored blazer, Brendan in a pressed shirt. They looked, I thought, like people expecting to sign paperwork for a property they'd already mentally moved into. We sat across from each other in the conference room. Forsyth set a folder on the table. He started with the straightforward items: the house, which came to me outright, the personal property, the vehicles. Brendan nodded along with a patience that was clearly costing him something. Then Forsyth reached the section that mattered. Eleanor's investment accounts and liquid assets totaled, at time of death, approximately $600,000. Amber sat up slightly. None of it went to Brendan. Eleanor had established a charitable trust in her name, the Eleanor Voss Family Fund, designated to support pediatric cancer research at Dayton Children's Hospital, where she had worked for decades and where, she wrote in the trust documents, she had watched too many families walk down the same hall we had walked. She had allocated a small personal gift to Dot, her oldest friend. She had left a letter for me. And she had left for Brendan a single item: her grandmother's recipe box, hand-painted blue and white, which had sat on our kitchen counter for as long as Brendan had been alive. That was it. The room was very quiet. Amber's face did something complicated. The composure she'd arrived with began to rearrange itself, slowly like ice under pressure, not cracking all at once but losing its shape. She looked at Forsyth. She looked at Brendan. She looked at her own hands on the table. Brendan said, "I don't understand." Forsyth said he was happy to review the documents again, that everything had been prepared and signed in accordance with Ohio state law, witnessed and notarized, and that Eleanor had been of sound mind and full capacity at the time of signing. Amber said, her voice very controlled, "Was there anything else? Any other accounts?" Forsyth told her the summary before them was complete. She stood up. She said something to Brendan I didn't catch. Then she walked out of the conference room. Not running, she wasn't the type, but walking with a stiffness that was its own kind of collapse. The door swung shut behind her. Brendan stared at the table for a long moment. When he finally looked up at me, I didn't know what I expected to see. Anger, maybe. Instead, he looked younger than he had in years, smaller, like something he'd been carrying a long time had suddenly become visible. I want to be clear about something, because I've thought about it every day since. I did not enjoy that moment the way you might expect. I was sitting in a conference room in November with my wife's will on the table in front of me, and Eleanor wasn't there. That was the fact I kept coming back to. She had done all of this, all the planning, all the quiet, careful work of the last 6 months, and she wasn't there to see any of it. She was gone. The house still smelled like her. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand. Her rose bushes needed to be cut back before the first hard frost, and I still hadn't done it because I couldn't figure out how she did it without asking her. And there was no one left to ask. Brendan stayed behind after Forsyth stepped out to give us a moment. He didn't say much. He asked if I'd known. I told him his mother had handled her affairs as she saw fit. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that somewhere internal. Then he asked about the recipe box. I told him I'd ship it to Chicago. He didn't argue. He didn't protest the rest of it, which surprised me. Maybe he understood, on some level, what his mother had been saying. Maybe Amber's reaction had clarified something for him. I don't know. We're not close enough yet for him to tell me things like that. Maybe that changes. I don't know that either. The recipe box was on the kitchen counter when I got home. I stood there looking at it for a while, the blue and white paint worn thin at the corners from 40 years of hands reaching into it. Eleanor's handwriting on the index cards inside, her pot roast, her apple cake, her mother's biscuit recipe that she'd been trying to perfect since 1987 and never quite got right. There was one card at the back that I hadn't seen before, in Eleanor's handwriting. No recipe on it. Just a note, a few lines, the ink slightly uneven the way her handwriting had become in those last months. Give this to Brendan when you're ready, not before. There's a difference between punishing him and teaching him. I hope he learns. I think he will. He's more like you than he lets on. Love you, Marty. I mean that past tense and present tense both. I sat down at the kitchen table and I stayed there for a long time. When I was ready, and it took me a while to get there, I called Brendan. Not about the estate, not about money. I just called to talk. It rang 4 times, and I almost hung up. Then he picked up and said, "Dad?" He sounded, for the first time in a very long time, like my son. I'm not sure what comes next for us. Some things don't get repaired cleanly, and I'm old enough to know that trying to force it is usually what ruins it for good. But Eleanor always said that the seeds worth waiting for are the ones that take the longest to come up. She said that about her rose bushes, actually. Every spring she'd wait for the first red tips pushing through the mulch, and every spring she acted surprised when they showed up, like they'd done something generous. I cut them back before the frost, finally. It took me longer than it would have taken her, and I probably did it wrong, but they'll come back in the spring. I'm counting on it. I keep coming back to that recipe box. The blue and white paint worn thin at the corners. Eleanor's handwriting on those index cards. Careful, slightly slanted, the way she wrote everything. There was nothing dramatic about it as an object. It sat on our counter for so long I stopped seeing it, but she saw it. She always saw things I stopped noticing. What I've understood, slowly, over these months since that Wednesday in Forsyth's office, is that Eleanor didn't make those decisions out of anger. I know that because I knew her. 41 years tells you something about a person's motives. She wasn't settling the score. She was making a statement about what actually matters, about the difference between what a person is owed and what a person has earned. Amber expected to be handed something she had never built, never tended, never sacrificed for. And Eleanor, quietly, from a hospice bed, said, "No, that's not how it works." There's a kind of integrity in that I'm still learning from. Eleanor had every opportunity to say nothing, to leave things as they were, to let the chips fall however they fell after she was gone. Most people would have. It's easier. But she took the harder road, not out of spite, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that letting bad behavior go unaddressed isn't kindness, it's avoidance. It just defers the damage onto everyone who comes after. I think about Brendan. I think about the look on his face in that conference room after Amber walked out. He looked stripped down to something real. And I've thought a lot about whether Eleanor was too hard on him, whether the son should pay for the wife's choices. I've gone back and forth on it more times than I can count. But I keep landing in the same place. Brendan made choices too. He chose to laugh at his mother's funeral. He chose to let Amber measure our home with her eyes and say nothing. He chose anticipation over grief. Those were his choices. And choices over time become character. That doesn't mean the story ends there. What I've come to believe, what I have to believe, honestly, to keep getting up in the morning, is that character isn't fixed. It bends under pressure, sure. Sometimes it breaks, but it can also be rebuilt, slowly, if a person has the honesty to look at themselves without flinching and the stubbornness to do the hard work of changing. That kind of stubbornness is something Eleanor had in abundance. I hope Brendan inherited more of it than I've given him credit for. The phone call I made, the one where he picked up and said, "Dad," and sounded like himself for the first time in years, that was a beginning. Small, fragile, nothing guaranteed. But Eleanor always said the seeds worth waiting for are the ones that take the longest. She said it about her rose bushes, but she meant it about people too. I cut those rose bushes back before the frost. Probably did it wrong, but they'll come up in the spring. I'm counting on that.